From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with author Keith McCloskey on his book, Mountain of the Dead, the Dyatlov Pass Incident. If you haven't heard part 1 yet, pause here and go back and listen to last week's episode first so that you understand what's going on. If you've already heard it, then welcome back to part 2 on this week's mystery, the Dyatlov Pass Incident, part 2 on From the Void. Yeah, I remember reading that, and I thought that's very, very odd because, as you said, slashing your way out of the tent, you would think that something, that would constitute that level of emergency, that they would be sprinting off in a different direction. But they were able to look at and examine the footprints leaving the tent, and that was definitely not the case. So that's obviously the first sort of puzzling piece to the whole thing.
Yeah. I mean. The other odd thing, you see, when you come to the avalanche theory, I don't believe it was an avalanche because when you look at the ridge where the tent was just below the ridge, there's very strong winds for a large part of the year coming from the west over the ridge, and that would blow a lot of the snow away. So there wouldn't have been that heavy a build-up of snow there anyway at the top. Obviously, there'd be a little bit more built up the further down you went nearer the tent, but I don't think enough to cause an avalanche. But even if you say there was an avalanche, and when we start talking about the injuries to some of them, the theory is that the avalanche caused some of the injuries, the cracked ribs to Zolotaryev and the girl Luda. It's estimated that they wouldn't have lasted more than 30 minutes with injuries like that, such severe injuries. But the footsteps, they would have needed to have been helped. But the footsteps showed that they were all walking individually. So you cannot believe that two people with crushed chests who've probably got less than 30 minutes to live were able to walk just normally away from it. I mean, I can't imagine, well, hopefully I'll never get a crushed chest, but I would think that I'd probably want to flop down on the floor with a major injury like that.
Yeah, that's one of the other curious pieces of evidence. Is, as you mentioned, there's the first half of the group who are found stripped of most of their clothing, who it shows that died of hypothermia, and then you've got the latter half of the group who are found later who have these sort of strange internal injuries without external markings.
I mean. It's like there's two lots of they died in two separate ways almost. Is what it looks like. You run into another theory of where they had the snow shelter, where they built the snow shelter in the ravine. There was a build up of snow above them, and that had caused some of the injuries, but. Again, I don't really think that that's the case. And although when you see the pictures of where they've dug out the actual ravine itself, I mean, I've stood at that ravine, and it's not that deep. It's deep enough, I suppose, but you think, well, I don't believe that there was been enough snow there to completely crush to two of them and cause strange other fractures to the rest of them. None of it adds up. That's the thing. And I also wonder that why, if they had if those injuries were caused later, I often wonder why there was no seeming interaction, if you like, between the ones that had died and the ones that were in the... It could be that obviously they stripped the bodies of the two that had died and thought, well, we'll just wait in the snow shelter. But I wouldn't have expected all four of them to just stay in there. But, at some point, one of them probably would have had to try and make go and see if they could get back to the tent, because even staying in the snow shelter, there's no heat, there's no food or anything, so your time there is probably going to be at best 12 hours in that cold if you're lucky, and you're managing to try and keep warm with the others, but none of it adds up at all. It really doesn't.
Yeah, and one thing I've failed to mention earlier is the fact that the time of year that they went was we're talking February, and so this is like probably one of I would imagine one of the more cold months
time
there.
Of the year. Yeah. Well, I understand they were testing their skills and all the rest of it, but as I say, it's a story that just never adds up at all. Why they behaved like they did, irrespective of what happened to them. But yeah, as I say, you can go through every theory. There's the theories about the Yeti. Another theory is that the local Mansi tribe were responsible, and that's got some basis to it, because everybody thinks, the Mansi were helping them in the search and they're all good people. Well, if I've looked back into the history of the Mansi, if you go back, not just the Mansi, but all these indigenous tribes that lived in the north and the far east, they were viewed really officially as savages, to be brought into the communist fold and educated. There's any number of stories about how they were ill-treated, really. They were given some help, but it was help of a kind of, if you don't like it, we'll make you sort of attitude. And the Mansi themselves were almost spiritual people. They worshipped the natural world, and the basically what the Soviets were doing was trampling all over their natural world by, they were mining and apparently there's talk that when the nuclear weapons moratorium came in, the Soviets shifted it up to the northern Urals. That's another theory. But here's the Mansi land, which they worship, and you've got all these people coming in and trampling all over it and looking for oil, blowing up nuclear weapons and storing nuclear warheads. And I can't imagine that the Mansi were all that crazy about their newcomer friends, as it were. And I was just going to say, the position of the female in Mansi society was lesser than that of a male. There were many areas that females couldn't go. The river, for instance, the river Lozva, which they would have been following for part of the route, parts of that were not allowed to be walked on by, not the river, but the river bank, where females were not meant to walk beside it, because it was supposed to be full of water spirits. And of course, you've got two females in the group who, were doing just that. There's this talk that the mountain itself is sacred, but there's been quite a few people who've refuted that. I've talked to a Mansi scholar in Eastern Europe who said that what his research showed is that the mountain, there are sacred mountains where females weren't allowed to go, but that wasn't one of them. But nonetheless, they were in an area that were, parts of it were considered sacred, and females weren't supposed to be there, and that probably would have upset them as well. One thing about the Mansi is they know everything that's going on in their area, who's in it, and even though it's a wilderness, but they know everything that's going on. However, they know. But while we were there, the local, one of the Mansi elders came up to see us, so he obviously knew we'd arrived, as it were. So they would have known that there were two females there without any doubt.
And as you said, that was one of the original theories. So talk a little bit about law enforcement's investigation into this, and what do they initially suspect? Because one thing that we can discuss here is, of the evidence left behind, obviously there's the the bodies and the tent, the shape of the tent, but they also largely kept some journals, and there's some photography that they were taking pictures along the way, so they can kind of piece some things together. So what initially do they think? What is sort of their initial reaction?
Well, the one main thing about it all is whatever was happening that night, there was something going on in the night sky, because there's several photographs of what appeared to be lights in the sky, and it isn't just the you could say, oh well, that's just exposure or whatever, but there's far too many witnesses of not just that particular night, but over a long time period of people as far away as Ivdel, which is 80 odd miles away, to seeing things happening in the night sky. Some of the lights seemed to separate from each other, and people have said, well, these sound like boosters for rockets falling away, which is possible. I've spoken to somebody who's an expert in that field, who said to me that some of the photos show what appears to be a kind of like a drone coming toward, although there were very early drones in those days, but like a drone coming towards it over a time frame of about three actual negatives. And he said if you take they had a pulse Doppler effect, that's quite possible. So it could be rockets. But again, how, and again, I favor the military theory of some kind, but how can you say that a rocket caused all their deaths? Even if a rocket came down, it didn't land on top of them, otherwise it would have crushed them all, or they'd be covered in fuel oil or burnt to death or whatever. But there's no evidence of that. So, but you can't get away from the fact that there's something going on in the night sky. So what was it? That's one of the questions.
Yeah, one of the theories I read at one point was something along the lines of some sort of testing that the military was doing surrounding explosives attached to parachutes, and as you said, that sort of explains maybe why they would initially leave the tent and why some of them may die of exposure, but it certainly doesn't explain the level of injuries that the other part of the group experienced.
Well, no, but it does. Yeah, I mean, the injuries, the crushed chest injuries to two of them, it's been said that they're similar to blast injuries because there's no marks on them. There were no marks, outer marks. It's just like it was like a car crash, but without any external marks on the chest. When I think Lev Ivanov agreed. He was one of the lead investigator on it. That it was similar to a blast injury, but then if it was a blast injury, why not all of them? Why just two of them affected in the same way with the crushed ribs? A blast surely would have hit all of them if it was that severe. But again, you start going round in circles and saying, well, maybe they were the two closest to a blast or whatever. What I did think about it, though, just thinking of it from my own point of view, is that if I'd been in that tent and suddenly I heard loud noises of some kind of military operation, I would start thinking, what the hell? I thought we were the only people up here. Have we landed in the middle of a military exercise with live weaponry? And you probably would slash your way out of the tent, especially if there was explosions going on. But like I say, it's still, I think if it'd been, say, 2 or 3 explosions that scared them enough to slash their way out of the tent, and then everything went quiet, that would explain the walking down fairly fast to the tree line, because at least in the trees you'd be safer than, from a blast than you would be up in the open, up on the ridge. So it would partially explain it, but again, it doesn't answer the injuries. It doesn't answer all the injuries. I mean, one of them had a fractured skull, but the fracture was behind his ear. How would that be caused by a large, all-encompassing blast?
Right. Yeah, and it was determined to not be a fatal type of fracture.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. No. But all the injuries are very, you get on to some of them were missing eyeballs, and Luda was missing her tongue. It just says the tongue was missing. It doesn't say it was cut out or anything like that. Ironically enough, Ludmila Dubonina was probably the most outspoken out of all of them. Very loud and, probably what you would call a definite feminist, if you like, for the time. But she spoke her mind, but it's just ironic that out of all of them, she was the one missing her tongue.
Yeah, talk a little bit about, so as you said, some of them were missing certain parts, and some of that has been attributed to, the bodies were sitting out exposed for a long time. It could have been animals. Like, has there been any research done, or I know over time they also, there was it was difficult to get access, I should say, to some of the reporting, and some of that has been released or let out into the public domain over the years. What do we know? What do we know about that?
Well, basically, the business about the missing tongue, or the missing eyes as well, and the rest of the injuries. I mean, the eyes sort of just, what's the word, that they lose their I wouldn't say rigidity, if you like, but they shrink, because of a lack of fluid. And there's talk that animals and bacteria had eaten it away as well, because by the time the bodies were, we're talking more about the 4 bodies found in the snow shelter, but by the time they were found, it was starting to thaw anyway. It was early May, so the snow was starting to thaw away. Animals were coming out of hibernation, although if there'd been any real animals, larger ones, a bear probably would have, had eaten them, but there was no sign of them being actually, what's the word? Not attacked isn't the word, but there was no sign of animal interference, larger animals, but possibly birds or smaller insects probably would have been at them, at the eyes. So that's one explanation for it. But a lot of people like to read into it. They were missing their eyeballs, and that had been done deliberately. However it was done. But I think it was more due to the passage of time and bacteria and insects that were responsible for it. Luda's missing tongue, again, they say bacteria possibly or whatever, but it's peculiar that she was the only one that was affected that way. So
yeah, you would think that they would be able to through autopsy determine whether or not the tongue was cut, or if it was deteriorated over time, or chewed or whatever.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem, you just mentioned it, is the autopsy, because bodies were taken to the morgue at Ivdel, and Yevgeny Yurikov was Lev Ivanov's senior, and he gave an interview, and he said that the chief prosecutor there had been present at the morgue for the autopsies. And he was interviewed by Leonid Proshkin, who was quite a good friend to the Institute. He was a prosecutor himself, a lawyer. And he said what he said to him was, when the chief prosecutor went up to the to the autopsy, he said, in your experience, had he ever done that before then or since then? And he said no, it was highly unusual for him to go there, the head honcho, basically, to be present at the autopsies. So if he had done that, you would say, well, why did he feel it necessary to be present while the autopsy was being done? Because the other thing that it leads on to is that the clothes were tested for radiation, some of the clothes. And strictly speaking, for 9 people to be found dead, basically on a ski hike, if you like, you would think death by misadventure, wouldn't you? Well, most people. I mean, if 9 people were found dead up in northern Canada or the Rockies in the middle of winter, you would think, well, they took their chances and they all perished. And you would, I don't know what the verdict is in America. Over here, you would say death by, in the UK, you'd say death by misadventure. But
yep.
So why would you even think to test clothes for radiation?
Yeah, that definitely raises some questions, and also just sort of the fact that they sort of locked the case down pretty early. Sort of anytime that happens, it of course spurs on all sorts of copious amounts of conspiracy theories.
Well, yeah, I mean, don't forget though, we're talking about the Soviet Union, where Ivan Smith, could not walk into the police headquarters in Sverdlovsk and say, I'd like to see this case file. It just wasn't something you would do. I mean, as I've said this before in interviews, the Moscow telephone directory was a classified document. So there is the element of it not being made available. But anybody, any normal citizen, possibly a relative could do it, maybe, but any normal citizen wanting to go to the police and ask or demand to look at files would attract a lot of unwelcome attention anyway, whatever the case was. It would be a case of, well, who do you think you are? In those days, everything was a state secret, and the mere fact of checking for radiation implies that there's some kind of military background to the whole thing. So anybody going to say, I want to see this file, theoretically you could say, well, yes, you can, but I doubt anybody would have the nerve to do it if he didn't want to attract a lot of unwelcome attention to himself.
Yeah, so talk about the initial aftermath, obviously, in the late 50s, early 60s. It's sort of a shut case for quite some time. I'm sure the families were not exactly satisfied with.
Well, no, but again, it wasn't a place where you complained. You just had to accept it. The thing is, the whole business of force, an overwhelming, compelling force. What Yurikov, who was Lev Ivanov's boss, he was like the number 2 in the department. He said that he and Ivanov were going to go back up there. They were looking to get a permit. They were going to ask for the help of the military troops to go up and really search the place and see what they could find, that might have been missed. And the whole case was just shut down completely. And it was done by the arrival of, I said Yurikov. A gentleman had arrived from Moscow, from the Procurator General's office, and demanded the case be shut down. And he told them to close the case down and say it was an accident. And when Leonid Proshkin was interviewing, I'll need to get the names right because I don't want to mix it. I don't speak Russian, and I'm often confusing Yurikov and Okishev. I'll just make sure. Do you edit this at all?
A little bit, yeah, sure. Yeah. I think the Okashev, I know was one of the gentlemen that I believe you spoke with when you went.
Yeah, Okashev. Yeah, it was. It was Leonid Proshkin was interviewing him, but somebody arrived from Moscow and shut the whole thing down, basically. Yurikov, it was his name, if I remember it rightly. But he just said to say it's an accident. So he apparently, according to Okshev, he took the files away with him. A lot of people have said, oh, well, the files were in the Sverdlovsk Oblast. But that leads me on to what I was just going to say now about the case being shut down, because there'd been a few attempts to close it. And in 2018, Yuri Kontsevich contacted me and said that he had got together with Leonid Proshkin and they were going to make an application to have the case reopened in Moscow. Could I help with the fees? So I did. I raised, legal fees and fees to be paid over there, which I did. I helped to raise most of the fees in the West and send them over. And they did. They made an application using one of the relatives to open up the case again, to re-examine it. And what came back was, I've got all the paperwork on it, but what came back was, it wasn't a flat no. What they said was, we do not feel that we have the jurisdiction to deal with this. It should be dealt with in the Sverdlovsk Oblast. And they refused when it went back to, don't get confused, the Sverdlovsk Oblast is still called that, whereas the city Sverdlovsk is now Yekaterinburg. So it went back to Yekaterinburg, and they basically refused. They said, no, we're not going to reopen it. And then, lo and behold, a few months later, it's reopened. That they reopened it themselves. But I believe that they reopened it to shut it down for good. So,
interesting.
With they had very definite ideas about what they were going to look at. They said, we're not looking at any nonsense about supernatural, blah, 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 and all the rest of it. So they reopened it and basically shut it down for good. And I can tell you another story about it all, is the involvement of the KGB. I cannot believe that the KGB, who are, the state security, would not have had some involvement in this case, because one of the rumors about the group was that they were trying to escape out of the USSR. But it's a strange way to escape. I thought there was a lot of easier ways of escaping. Climbing up into the northern Ural Mountains, you think, well, the next stop after that is the Arctic, or possibly Norway, but you've got to cross God knows how many military zones to even get there. But the mere fact that that was a rumor would have attracted the attention of the KGB, and yet they say the KGB weren't involved in it. So who knows?
Yeah, a lot of the sort of evidence and sort of some of the open-ended questions there seem to point towards some sort of military involvement. And so, what are some of the more, what you feel would be the more credible sort of predominant theories behind what happened?
Well, to me, it's the attitude of the authorities that points to something doing with the government. If they were, I've spoken to Russians over there who say, well, it's been a long time, why not just come clean with it all? But it's not in the Russian nature to open up on things. Everything's a state secret, or it seems to be. But so much time has passed that if there is closed files on it, or people know what's happened, why not just say, well, this was it. It was a different time. It shouldn't have been done, and have done with it. But that doesn't seem as if that's going to happen. But I tend to lean towards the military myself. But I cannot, like everything, I can't make the facts fit. They were possibly scared out of their tent by some military action going on around them. it could well be. But then you could say, well, the avalanche theory is just as plausible, and the injuries happen to them further down. I mean, I've written the foreword for a book by Henning Kirsten, he's a climber, and he actually came up with a theory I did like very much about ball lightning, because when you look at, he examined the photographs of them in the morgue, and a lot of the injuries that were caused, if you look at the arms and where the way the veins are, the injuries like that are caused by burns from lightning. And he wrote a book called the Dyatlov incident, not a cold case. So it's I thought it was quite a plausible theory, because ball lightning would actually frighten you, because you wouldn't know what the hell it was. And I can imagine not necessarily running away from it, because it moves very slowly, and that would account for them walking down to the bottom, of the hill. So it was a theory I quite liked, because it gave an explanation of natural phenomena and then death by misadventure, if you like. They were getting away from it, and it did cause some injuries to them, but they got away from it, but then died of the cold. But, there's any number of theories, though. It's
Yeah, and that one's interesting too, because it kind of, as you mentioned earlier, kind of falls in line with sort of some of these reports from other groups in the area of seeing sort of like lights in the sky and that sort of thing. And
it partly accounts for lights in the sky as well. It doesn't necessarily answer why they would test for radiation on clothes, but it comes closer than most. There's like I said to you, there's a nuclear warhead area, storage area. It's been there since the 90s. It's still there now, but that is a good bit further south. It's just past Ivdel. And there's a lot of nuclear warhead. They reprocess them there, and they store them, so that there is nuclear material in the area, if you like. But I still can't see how that would get onto clothes up in the 80 or 100. Well, not necessarily 100, but certainly a good 80 miles away. I don't see how it would affect them.
Yeah, that is very puzzling. That's really interesting, and I also thought it was very interesting is some of the information that you obtained from the 2015 interview with Yevgeny Okashev. I hopefully pronounced that correctly, but and just some of the strange discrepancies that he noticed. He was one of the last few remaining living individuals who was firsthand witness to this event. Yeah.
I think he had his finger on the pulse. He knew that there was a lot more to it, and he was saying that he says they were ordered to shut it down. He was saying he wanted to go back up with Lev Ivanov to have a good search. He was approaching the problem the right way. He was saying there's obviously more going on here that we don't know about. Let's go back up and have another look. And then suddenly the whole thing's closed down. So, people have called it the ramblings of an old man, but he was still pretty sharp. I think he out of all of them came closest to describing what was going on, and he mentions the fact about the moratorium on nuclear weapons testing above ground. That came into force, and the possibility that the Soviets were doing something up in the Urals. They'd moved it away. I think it was down in Kazakhstan where a lot of the nuclear testing was done. So to take the suspicion away from it, they carried on basically doing it up in the Urals. But having said that, he obviously couldn't say too much, because the one grip that the government over there always had on all these people, they're government employees, they control their pensions. So you couldn't put yourself out too far.
Yeah, very true. So, just sort of finding a good spot to end here. It obviously fascinating mystery, very sort of complex, and every time you feel like you find a theory that fits, it doesn't quite fit in with that puzzle piece, if you know what I mean. And so it can be sort of frustrating in the sense that there is no clean cut answer, it seems. Do you think this will ever be solved, or is it just too far
I
back?
don't know. No, if it's left as it is, I don't think it'll ever be solved. I really don't. Unless the nearest thing this would have had to been solved, and I've said this before, is it was after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Everything was up for sale, basically. It was a completely different atmosphere. People were able to talk. They were able to leave the Soviet Union, or what was the countries were breaking away. I think if it was ever going to have been got to the bottom of, if you like, that would have been the time. And when it was Russia was being run by Boris Yeltsin, and okay, he has plenty of critics, but he seemed to be somebody with a conscience, and he had been to the same university that they had been at. The UPI, the Urals Polytechnic Institute. He had been a former student himself, but the way he handled the what's the best way of putting it? About the murder of the royal family. He allowed all that to come out, if you like, and to atone for the sin of what happened to them. And I think if somebody had approached him and said, look, can we get to the bottom of what happened to the Dyatlov group, I think he probably would have, pushed for that to happen. But it's just gone the other way. I mean, Russia now, it seems to me, is as bad as it ever was from the point of view of secrets. It's in the national psyche. I think they don't, even when I was over, the visits I've made, people don't talk about the government and, government policy or anything as a subject to be avoided. I mean, okay, you could say, well, it's not my place to be talking about it anyway, but nobody's willing to engage in conversation. And laws have been brought in, since, in the last, 10 or 15 years that make any military subject really a state secret, so that, you can't, if you'd been serving, I don't know, in the infantry and done a few years in the infantry, you would be theoretically, if you were to talk about it openly or write a book about it, you could be taken to a court and imprisoned for revealing state secrets. That bad. There was a guy who was working on, put it in the book, on satellites, military satellites, who'd. Although it was quite old technology that he'd worked on, he applied for a job in Sweden, working in, hoping to upgrade his experience, and he was sent to prison just for applying for a job.
Wow.
So it's, and I think, like I say, when you've got that kind of atmosphere, people don't want to talk or dig. So that's the problem. So I just to come back to your question, I don't think it'll ever be solved. It won't be solved with that kind of atmosphere, and I think the window where it could have been solved has passed.
Yeah, it sort of feels like if there are people still living who had the answers, they're certainly not talking.
Well, not only that, people who are still living, who can remember those days, they're dying away now. You're talking about 1959, so anybody who might have been involved in a cover-up from then is probably long gone or very close to it now. It's faded into history, basically, the story.
Yeah, this is certainly a story and a mystery that's sort of up there with like Amelia Earhart, in the sense that we may never really know what really happened to these poor individuals. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing this with us. For folks listening, Keith has a great book out there called Mountain of the Dead, the Dyatlov Pass Incident. Go check it out. Where can people stay up on top of what you're up to, and are you working on anything currently, I should ask?
Well, yeah, what I'm hoping to do is I'm going to have to visit, but I don't know if you would know about the two Dutch girls that disappeared in Panama in 2013. Have you heard of? Well, if you have a look, just type into Google "two Dutch girls disappeared Panama." It's a very interesting story. I mean, they disappeared, but parts of their bodies were found. That's all they ever found, and I'd like to go down there. I'm looking at doing it early next year, and retracing their steps. Basically, I mean, again, there's all sorts of theories about what happened to them, but they were down there visiting for a holiday. It was kind of a working holiday. They were going to work, learning Spanish and teaching children and all the rest, working in an orphanage. And one day they went on a hiking trip on a known nature trail, if you like, as scenic route. But instead of turning around when they got to the top of the route, they kept on going. And like the Dyatlov thing, they've recovered their cameras, and there's all sorts of weird photos. They're named Lisanne Froon and Chris Kramers, if you look it up. But weird photos, body parts. It's. And again, I I have 3 daughters of my own. It's an awful thing to happen. But they've never really got to the bottom of what happened to them.
Yeah, it's certainly worthy of further investigation, if for no other reason to try to help provide more information to the families out there.
I've got I have a couple of. You should go into these things with an open mind, but I've really looked at the case, and I know somebody who's very familiar with it, and I have actually got a theory, but which I won't disclose just now. But I think for anything like this, for me to write a book about the 2 girls who disappeared in Panama, I think you got to go there, go where they went, and see what it's like, and hopefully not disappear. I mean, it's easily done. I nearly did. Just sorry to digress for a minute, but I was down in the what's called now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. My sister was down there, her husband, some years back, and we went to visit a leprosy, a place where it was AIDS research and leprosy missionary station. Anyway, we went for a drive, and we found what was quite a nice spot, and there was a river there, and I crossed over. It was only a small river. I crossed over it, and it was quite scenic, and I just kept walking and walking and walking, and after 30 minutes, I literally realized I didn't know where the hell I was, and panic, the sheer panic and fear that I felt, because I'd taken several forks, and I couldn't remember which, and I thought, I'm in the middle of Africa, in a country that's falling apart, which it was Zaire then under President Mobutu. And I thought, it was just blind panic. And then I remembered, fortunately, there was a very large tree near where we'd parked, and I could see it. And all I had to do was make my way back to that. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be talking to you tonight, I think. So it's getting lost is actually quite an easy thing to do. But there's all sorts of theories about these 2 poor girls. But it's a story worth looking at. Like I say, have a look on Google, because their cameras were recovered with a lot of strange photos on them. It's definitely worth a look at. Yeah, well,
be safe, and love to have you back on when you finish with that project.
Okay.
But, thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, John. Thank you
really
very much.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of From the Void. We'll be back soon with a brand new episode and some previews in terms of what we're up to for the fall. So until then, please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing to the show and sharing with a friend. It helps us get the word out. Also, check out our brand new website, www.fromthevoidpod.com, for all things From the Void and previews of that special project that we've been alluding to that we're working on and very excited for the fall. So until next time, I've been your host, John Williamson, and you've been listening to From the Void.